Hello, this is Sputnik News Live, and I'm your host, Dimitri Symes Jr. Today, we're going to talk about the future of social media in a world of geopolitical turbulence. And we're very pleased to welcome a special guest, Mario Nawfal, an experienced investor and the host of the largest show on X. Mario, thank you so much for joining us.
How are you, Dimitri? Good to be here.
So Mario, there's a lot of things that we want to discuss today, but let's start with the arrest of Pavel Durov, which has dominated headlines over the past week. This is obviously a fast developing case, but what are the main takeaways for you so far from what's happened?
Look, it's a reminder that free speech and even privacy is becoming more and more of an illusion rather than reality. So a lot of us have known this for a while. We've seen the censorship that happens in every single country around the world, including democracies like Europe, the US, Brazil. And Pavel's arrest kind of takes another social media platform off the list of those who want to censor, those who want power. What's left? So they've targeted TikTok. They've got that out of the way. They've got Meta, Google, that's already in their pocket. They've just gotten Telegram now. All we have left is X and Rumble. And X has already been targeted. Yesterday, we've got the Moraes, the Chief Justice in Brazil, banning or at least trying to ban X in Brazil, the third largest democracy in the world. And that's days after Pavel's arrested in France for allegations that relate to what people are posting on his platform. So it's a very concerning time for any journalist. It's a concerning time for any social media platform. Yet it's a concerning time for any citizen, because we've seen in the UK recently as well with the riots, what happens when free speech is cracked down. And it's not pretty. We've had people arrested and go to jail for months and years for things they said online. So I think Pavel's arrest is just another step in that direction, a very concerning direction, as not only free speech is getting eroded, but power is getting concentrated. That's my concern.
So when you look at Pavel Durov's arrest, you view it as part of a larger global trend. I take it you don't buy Macron's argument that this was a narrowly targeted legal case for against Telegram for specific violations.
Well, the violation has kind of been clear. The violations are what people are posting on the platform. So they're essentially holding him responsible for what others are doing on his platform. And we know that Pavel has, cracked down on illegal activity as much as he can, but he also protects privacy. He's had issues in Russia for the same reason many years ago. And now he's having the same issue in France. In France, other European countries, they love to criticize Russia for not supporting free speech. Yet they've done the same thing Russia's done to Pavel many years ago. They've gone even a step further. They've arrested Pavel years later in a so-called democracy. So the hypocrisy there is very concerning. Macron's argument, while we don't know what we don't know, so we don't have all the details of the case, we don't have all the evidence, but if you look at the list of events over the last few months and years, it cannot be a coincidence anymore. It cannot be a coincidence that all social media platforms are either colluding with governments, and the ones that are not colluding with governments are being targeted in one way or another. Elon's being called an enemy of the US. Instead of being praised as a hero, he's being called by some politicians that are obsessed with having more power. He's being called an enemy of the country. You've got Rumble being banned in some European countries, and now you've got Telegram, the founder and CEO is arrested in France, who, according to him, he was going to have dinner with the president. So you just can't make this stuff up. And I'm a person that's also concerned on a personal level when seeing those things. I've been invited by another president days ago to go interview him. Days ago by another president. I won't name who that is, at least not yet. And I'm very sure that I would probably ended up like Pavel if I went there. It's a country that I've criticized. They cracked down on free speech. I've been very critical of that country. They've attacked Elon heavily. and to be invited by the president to go interview him. And they only accepted an interview in person, not online. And again, that was just, they invited me maybe 4 days before Pavel. So I've added France to the countries that I cannot go to. I would not go to. Obviously, the UK with the crackdown they've had on free speech. Brazil, I did another space yesterday. I've had President Bolsonaro on my show. Yesterday, I had his son. I've had other politicians criticizing Moraes' decision to ban X. Pakistan is on my list of countries I can't go to because of having Imran Khan and supporting Imran Khan, Prime Minister Imran Khan. I never expected France to be on one of those countries, but here we are.
You know, you bring up an interesting point about Pavel Durov's, the way he was treated in Russia and the way he was treated in France. Now, I think it's no secret to people who are watching and listening that Russia's attitude towards Telegram has evolved over the years. There are times when the Russian government had a stricter and more negative attitude, but I think that most people can confirm that in recent years, the attitude has become more relaxed. And so in Russia, while using Telegram, you can read Ukrainian channels, you can read Western media like BBC, like some media which are even formally forbidden in Russia on Telegram. The same cannot be said about the European Union, where if you want to read Sputnik and RT, you aren't able to do that. So I guess, you know, Mario, as someone who knows the West quite well, what explains this sort of shift rapid on free speech and the ability to tolerate dissenting points of view?
Dimitri, I'm going to tell you something, and I try not to take positions on any topic. That's because nothing is black and white. There is no country that supports free speech in absolute terms. No country. Free speech is being weaponized, especially today with the geopolitical tensions that we're seeing. So every country loves to kind of support free speech as long as it works in its best interest. Every country. Now, ask me about the West. Well, the West loved Telegram when it supported their causes. When Telegram was used in Belarus as part of the revolution, or when it was used by Russians or by Ukrainians, and it was causing harm, strategic harm to Russia, it was a tool that the West could use. But when Telegram became more of a nuisance, became more of a potential risk or a cost for the West, now it's not that convenient to support free speech when it comes to Telegram. Again, I'm using the West as an example. It applies to Russia, applies to Australia, applies to Latin America. It's just human nature. And I think we need to get to a place where you cannot politicize free speech. Free speech should become a human right. And we are veering away from this position, or from this value. And people just don't understand the cost that comes with that, the cost when you start losing your voice. And people are starting to see that. They're starting to realize it. People in Brazil are seeing the crackdown that they have there. You know, Elon did not want to censor me and Elon. I brought them on my stage. Elon did not ban them on X. So they launched an investigation into Elon. They included me in that investigation. People in Brazil were banned to go into my spaces. When I do a show, people in Brazil cannot join my show. They get blocked from it. They have to use a VPN to join it. I'm starting to notice these things. In the UK, they're starting to notice how the government just cracked down on anyone that had anything critical to say online, and many of them getting jailed. People in France are noticing what their president did, or allegedly did. So I think the pattern that we're heading down, and applies to every single country, where you start politicizing free speech and only supporting it when it works in that country's best interest, I hope it backfires. I hope people start to realize that this is happening. And I hope they start taking action. Because otherwise, the path, if we don't do this, the alternative path is a very concerning one, where there'd be a severe centralization or a severe level of control among governments, among large companies, among large organizations on what gets said online. When that happens, then they start determining what the narrative is. And when that happens, it's no longer a democracy and not a world anyone wants to live in.
You know, we're just in the early stages of this conversation, and we've already discussed geopolitical implications, questions of national sovereignty, free speech. It seems like the Durov arrest would be prime time news, right? That this would be the thing that everyone would be talking about, especially since this is late August. There's an overall slow news cycle. But one thing that myself and my colleagues were surprised to see is that much of the big Western legacy media were not all that interested in the story. You were very quick on the story. We tried to be very quick on the story. But for example, CNN, NBC, some other major outlets, it took them hours to get the initial story about the arrest out. How would you explain this relative lack of interest in the Durov story and its potential implications?
Look, there's two ways of looking at it. One way is that not many people in the US use Telegram. That's one argument you could make. So it wasn't mainstream news. But then if you look at mainstream news outlets in other countries that had a much higher adoption of Telegram, the same applied. They did not use it. So then you start wondering why. You can only speculate here. But if you look again, we talked about different patterns. Mainstream media have increasingly been censoring narratives that don't fit their agenda, that of their advertisers, or that of the government. The arrest of Pavel fits that description. No, they don't want to bring awareness to censorship when they're complicit in that. So kind of the skeptical, speculative guess that I have is that was intentional, and they don't want to shed light on the crackdown on free speech around the world. The alternative is that just the audience didn't care, but that seems to be less and less likely as you really look into the speed and the way it was covered. Not only how long it took them to cover it, and how little awareness or attention they brought to the topic, a very serious topic, very, very serious topic, but also the way they've described it. And it's just it wasn't objective journalism.
One other thing that comes to mind is that tech journalists in the United States have a very adversarial relationship with Silicon Valley, with big tech business people, which in theory is not a bad thing because adversarial journalism can breed some interesting investigations, so on and so forth. But it is a sharp contrast with the way that they, for example, treat the White House or the Pentagon or people in Congress. Long before I came to Sputnik, there was a short period when I actually worked as a correspondent on Capitol Hill. And I saw with what adulation most reporters treated Nancy Pelosi, Hakeem Jeffries, and other major congressional Democrats. Why is it that in so many spheres of Western journalism, there's such a good relationship between journalists and people in power, but it seems to be the reverse when it comes to big tech?
It's a very complex relationship. I think, look, one should be critical of big tech. The amount of influence they have over every aspect of society is something that's not being discussed enough. So I think being critical of big tech, being critical of, especially recently, being critical of the way they've addressed certain issues, COVID being the most obvious example, I think one should be critical of those. Now, if you're talking about the amicable relationship or the kind of the biased relationship that journalists have with certain politicians, I think the only way to describe it is that it's more of a cabal. Now, I'm an optimist. I still think the US is one of the best democracies there is. I still believe in the US, the legal system. I still believe in US democracy. I still believe in US freedom of press. But I also see the cracks. And I'm very concerned that those cracks are not being addressed. So when I talk about cabal, it's become systemic. You've got those unelected officials that have, behind the scenes, have just got so much influence on various aspects of society. Talking about the Hunter Biden laptop, and if we saw in the Twitter files how that was censored and that was called Russian propaganda. It starts to kind of stain that image we have of the democracy that is the United States. And then the question was about the relationship between journalists and those politicians that kind of fit that are part of that system. And it's become more of a cycle. where politicians, through various means, influence the media, usually through financial means. They influence the media from the top down. And then the executives start influencing the journalists. And the journalists unknowingly become biased in many cases. Some of them are not doing it intentionally, but they're all within the same circle. It becomes more of an echo chamber. And those journalists start to build certain narratives and start to believe those narratives. Now, there are cracks in this as well. There's hope. A lot of these journalists are starting to realize that. A lot of them are starting to, citizen journalism is growing pretty rapidly in the West. And they're starting to break off the large media companies and starting to have their own voice, a biased voice, but their own voice. Everyone's biased. It's very difficult to be objective, but that's fine. But they're breaking away from the system. Tucker Carlson being the most obvious example. Tucker Carlson was to an extent part of the system, but he was breaking away from it gradually. And eventually now he's just an independent journalist. There is no boss. There is no higher up that influences what he says. He's the most obvious example. He's not the only one. And so we are seeing that breakaway. And I think we're going to continue seeing it because the ratings speak for themselves. All these mainstream media companies, all these journalists that are not paid that well, they are, losing an audience, losing revenue. And as they lose more revenue, losing influence as well. And as that continues happening, and a lot of that attention goes to platforms like X, then they eventually will be forced to either die or pivot and become more objective and try to regain trust of their audience. So there is that cabal. We're going to continue seeing that materialize in front of our eyes, but it is starting to break down, especially since Trump took office.
You talked a lot about journalist bias. I want to ask you also about journalist competence, because I think that's a lot of the issue that comes up, right? Because when you see that certain journalists write on, let's say, topics on Russia or topics on the Chinese economy or some other topic, they don't have the necessary background knowledge to really evaluate evidence, to evaluate sources, and to write in an informative way about the topic. Do you see a similar problem when we look at the way the media writes about technologies? Or are the journalists working in that sphere more competent and more informed?
Look, not all journalists are equal. I don't want to attack journalism. I think journalism is one of the most noble professions to have. They've shed light on some of the biggest secrets, biggest atrocities in the world. They've broken stories that changed the world we live in today. So I think journalism is an incredibly noble and important profession. But when I say not all journalists are the same, please compare this to. I had a journalist that kind of wrote a hit piece on me. Obviously, every single person has had a hit piece. Anyone that goes against the mainstream media has had a hit piece against them. It was a very flawed hit piece. They knew the information was wrong. I got them on record admitting the information was wrong. It was such a weak, I wouldn't call it journalism. It was pure propaganda. And the journalist had a history of attacking Elon. Okay? But he calls himself a journalist. There's journalists right now in war zones, whether it's in Ukraine or Palestine or any other country, and facing the risk of death, reporting from the ground, filming things that no one else would be able to watch if they weren't there filming it. Would you put a journalist that's in a war zone like Iraq in the same basket as a journalist that's sitting there writing about a hit piece about Elon or about
Obviously
someone else
not.
similar to Elon? So even though everyone's called a journalist, there's different levels of journalists. There's ones that are, either just writing completely biased paparazzi pieces, and others that are doing proper journalism. There's some that are corrupted by the system that they operate in. There's others trying to do proper work. Right? So journalism journalists are not the problem. They're not all equal. Some are competent, some are not. That's not my concern. Competence is not my concern. My concern is the system itself. It's just become embedded in journalism where you can't have a journalist write a piece on Pfizer. Let's say there's they managed to discover something damning about the company. Well, Pfizer that spends tens of millions of dollars with that company, with that media company, what do you think they'll do when they found out about that expose? What choice does the company have? If Pfizer pulls out the advertising revenue, the company won't be able to pay their journalists and they'll eventually go bankrupt, especially today with profit margins at an all-time low. So the system has become so flawed, and I'm not even talking about government intervention. That's a whole different kettle of fish. Without even discussing that, just the within legal means where advertisers' influence was being written, I don't know how to fix it. You know, I've had executives at those media companies come to me, talk to me. It's like, Mario, very objectively. I don't want to attack mainstream media. I just think the system is flawed. We got to find a way to fix it if possible. I don't know if it's even fixable anymore. Trust has just been destroyed. But they come to me, they're like, Mario, how do you think we can rebuild trust? And I remember the conversation I had not long ago, and I genuinely told them, I said to them, I don't think it's possible anymore. Trust has been broken to such levels that rebuilding it is not only an impossible task, it financially doesn't make sense anymore. And I told them, I think it financially makes more sense to either create a completely new brand, build it from the ground up, and try to avoid the mistakes that were done previously over the last few decades that led to mainstream media that we know today.
Your analysis of broken trust gives a nice pivot to my next question, which is returning to the Durov arrest. You know, since Macron came into office, he has tried to present France as a startup nation. And back in 2018, he even tried to persuade Durov to move Telegram's headquarters to Paris. Now he's done a complete 180. I want to get your perspective as an investor, as someone who regularly interviews leading tech voices. How is this whole situation impacting France's image as a potential destination for investment, as a potential source of?
I got the question. So I've interviewed a lot of investors. You know, we do finance show. I've had Bill Ackman, I've had Mark Cuban, I've had Mark Andreessen, etc. on the show. So I understand that world really well. How it impacts France's image, I think that's a no-brainer. I literally said to you earlier in the interview, I love France. I adore the country. I'm worried to go to that country now. Not as much as Brazil and Pakistan, even not as much as the UK, but I'm still concerned. You know, there's a lot of talk and a good argument to be made that the US had influence on Macron's decision, or France's decision to arrest Pavel. Now, so that's how it impacts France's image as a hub for entrepreneurs and anyone in the world of social media, anything to do with free speech and privacy. So that's an easy question to answer. But the more difficult question is why. That's something I already answered as well earlier, but I want to reiterate. France and the West supported Telegram when it was an asset, a strategic asset, and now are cracking down on Telegram, potentially, because it's become more of a thorn for them. They cannot control what, Telegram is used by a lot of Ukrainians, Telegram is used by a lot of Russians. So if they want to censor some information that's being shared by Russians on Telegram that is seen by Ukrainians, they're not able to do that. That's not a strategic asset. So the reason why they're doing this now, and they didn't do that in 2018 when he was, asking Telegram to move their headquarters to France, is obviously based on geopolitical tensions that we're seeing and the landscape, how it's changed over the last decade. Now, there's even a more a different angle to take that, a more pessimistic angle, is that France wanted to move the headquarters of Telegram to the country in the first place, is to have more control a decade ago. When they couldn't do that, they tried to do it through other means, and they failed. And this is a last resort for them when all else fails.
I think obviously France has been in the headlines, has been dominating the focus because they were the ones who went after Durov. But it's important, I think, to think about the larger context, because Europe recently passed the Digital Services Act, which really created this whole new system of regulation and limitations for big social media companies. And I had an opportunity to speak yesterday with veteran journalist Pepe Escobar, who's lived in France for many years, who's worked in the country, who knows the country's politics well. And the way he described the Digital Services Act is that the Europeans realized that they could not out-innovate the United States, that they could not out-innovate China in terms of tech. So they decided to instead out-regulate them. Does that kind of mesh with what you're seeing in the European tech space?
I don't see how. It's a bit of a paradox because, over-regulation is the complete opposite of innovation. So they're trying to out-innovate the US. If they're trying to out-innovate China, out-regulating them is not the right way to do it. Now, are they actually out-regulating those countries? A lot of people are saying we've lost the EU. Free speech. We're past the stage of fighting for free speech in Europe. I had Tommy Robinson on the show. You can love him or hate him. The guy's on the run. He's out of the country. Again, he has stances that are very controversial. I don't care about what his stances are. I care about someone that has the right to say whatever he wants to say, and he's just one example. That's free speech as long as it doesn't break any laws. And we've seen the politicization of the legal system of the country to try to bring him down. He's going to go back to the UK. I asked him on my show 2-3 days ago, and he's expected to go to jail again, just based on a documentary he put out. I watched the documentary. No calls for violence, nothing illegal, nothing close to being illegal. Just an investigative documentary that they've banned on all social media platforms except X, and now they've subpoenaed him to try to get him back into the country and most likely jail him. So I think the fact that do you remember that what was his name? Thierry sent out a letter to Elon. Do you remember that before the Trump interview, urging him not to conduct the interview?
I do remember that.
That's an interview. That's an interview by an American businessman and an American former president, and they've got the EU sending out a letter warning them on what content they talk about on the platform. They'll tell you how far Europe has gone down the world of not only over-regulation, but just complete obsession with holding power. So, I think, the days of out-innovating the US and out-innovating China are past, are behind us now, unless we see drastic change in the region. And it doesn't look like that's going to happen anytime soon.
And I'm glad you brought up the letter to Elon Musk, because the EU regulators have repeatedly expressed grievances with Elon, expressed grievances with Twitter, X, sorry. Given what we've seen happen to Durov, do you have any concerns about X's future in Europe?
I remember when I had Elon, so I've had Elon a few times on the show. And I think the second or third time that I had him on, it was a long time ago. And I'm going to paraphrase something he said. He said something along the lines of, I'll never commit suicide. If I ever die, I'll never commit suicide. Something along those lines, which indicates, and I've had others say that on my stage, other people that are being targeted for similar reasons. And when he first said it, I'm like, okay, that seems like a lot. Yes, for him to say that he's the most powerful person, the richest person in the world, a very powerful person, massive following, and he lives in the United States, the world's biggest democracy, or second biggest after India. But then if you look at where we are today, you had the former president just avoid an assassination attempt. And I'm not going to go down the path of how the hell this even happened. That's a whole other discussion. But you've got the former president and the Republican candidate just avoid an assassination attempt. You've got the leader of one of the biggest social media platforms just get arrested in France, in another democracy. You've just got Brazil launching an investigation into Elon because he didn't suspend the few accounts that were against the government. And they're about not only to ban X, they've literally frozen the bank accounts of Starlink that had nothing to do with X, just because Elon is involved with Starlink, because he founded Starlink of SpaceX. And again, Brazil is the third largest democracy in the world. Many people don't know that. The third largest democracy in the world just did that. So to not be concerned for Elon after the events we've seen unfold over the last year would be illogical. Now we're seeing Elon already targeted, and not only in Brazil, not only in Pakistan, not only in India, not only in Europe. He's being targeted in the US. We've seen the Biden administration targeting through various three-letter agencies, targeting his companies. The narrative against Elon being considered, I can't remember who called him an enemy of the state. How's that a democracy? How is that, you've got one of the biggest and smartest innovators of their country, someone they should be proud of, because they cannot control him, because they cannot control his platforms, they target him, they target his companies, and they label him as an enemy of the state.
That actually brings up my next question, because as you mentioned throughout this conversation, this is not just an issue related to France. This is not just an issue related to Europe, but it's in very many ways a global issue. And that even in the United States, where free speech is protected under the First Amendment, we're seeing this campaign against quote-unquote disinformation. And we saw Mark Zuckerberg recently admit that he censored content on his platforms related to COVID based on requests from the Biden administration. How do you see the future of independent free speech social media in the United States? Can the First Amendment prevail over political pressure?
So RFK had his Instagram banned a while ago, and they didn't give him a reason. Typical Meta. They never gave him a reason, because there was nothing to do with misinformation or disinformation. Disinformation is intentional. Misinformation is unintentional, unintentionally misleading, unintentionally false. He had none of those. So they created a new term called malinformation. That's essentially factual information used with malicious intentions. Please let me know how the hell someone can determine whether something is malinformation or not. So if you post something that's factual, that criticizes the incumbent government, is that something that can be censored? So going back to Zuckerberg's apology, it's a very interesting development. A lot of people are trying to link it to Pavel's arrest, and whether it's connected to that. Pavel was arrested on Saturday. No, he was on Saturday, and then the statement came out by Mark Zuckerberg on Monday. It doesn't seem related. 2 days. These statements take a lot longer to prepare. Then you have another kind of argument being made, or more speculation, is that it's linked to Trump's new book. So Trump in his new book kind of threatened Mark Zuckerberg with jail if he interferes in the next election, in this year's election. So it could be Mark kind of preparing himself for potential Trump administration, or it could be just Mark really feeling guilty for either being tricked or complying with the Biden administration's successful attempts to censor. The positive thing is that could indicate a shift. I'm an optimist. I genuinely think a lot of these people, even though they're very left-leaning, a lot of these employees at those social media companies, they genuinely support free speech. Even when it comes to things they disagree with, they are biased. 90 whatever percent of them donate to the Democrats. That's an issue that's difficult to address. Bias is part of human nature. But I genuinely think that their intentions are good. And I hope they've been watching what Elon's been doing. I had Mark Andreessen on the show, Andreessen Horowitz. And he told me something that I'd never forget. That was a while ago, about a year ago. He said, Mario, because that was not long after Elon acquired Twitter back then. He said, Mario, he's on the board of directors for Meta, as far as I know. And he said they're watching, Meta and other companies are watching Elon and Twitter very carefully, almost like an experiment. So and they've copied a few things that Elon did with Twitter. So I genuinely think that Meta will start, kind of taking a page out of Elon's book. And while they'll never be, you'll never see absolute free speech, I hope they start resisting any censorship attempts. And I hope you'll see more social media companies go down a similar path to Elon. But when you start seeing people like Pavel get arrested in a country like France, you've got these executives that'll be very concerned. Like, why was Pavel, why is he being targeted on a criminal level? Why can't the company be sued first on a civil level? When you start having executives targeted on a criminal level, if I'm in their shoes, I'd be terrified right now. So a very difficult position to be in. But I hope Mark means the statement sincerely, and I hope you see change at Meta, similar to how we saw change at Twitter once Elon acquired it.
You say that a lot of people in Silicon Valley mean well. I guess that begs the question, why do they give in to these sort of demands from the Biden administration, from legacy media outlets, which, as you say, are losing their influence? Why can't they just say, look, we're a major company, we have free amendment rights, we're not going to censor things just because you send us angry emails?
Well, Elon's doing that. How's that going for him? Have you seen advertisers boycott X? They're trying to strangle the company. Have you seen how Elon and his companies are being targeted? It's not easy to stand up. If the FBI comes in with a request, it's not easy to say no to the FBI. That's one. Number two is they're being tricked as well. If you look at the Twitter files, how the Biden laptop was censored, the FBI went, I'm not sure if you saw the Twitter files, but the FBI, and we've covered those extensively, the FBI went to Facebook's team and they warned them in advance saying, hey, there's going to be a campaign, a Russian disinformation campaign. That's during the 2020 elections. There's going to be a Russian disinformation campaign linked to Burisma, something to do with Hunter Biden. So they kind of hinted, and Mark Zuckerberg talked about it, I think on the Joe Rogan show. They've kind of prepared them. They've kind of planted the seed. So a lot of these employees at Facebook genuinely thought that was a Russian disinformation campaign. And there's instances in the Twitter files, when you go through this communication that Elon leaked, or that he released, there's many instances where Twitter employees, and I think the same would apply to Meta and Facebook and Google, where they tried to resist certain requests for censorship. But it's very difficult to say no to the CIA, to the FBI, and to those three-letter agencies.
Do you think that the US presidential election that's coming up in November will impact us in any way? Because from outside of the United States, there's obviously an active debate whether Trump returning to office would significantly change the US vector, or whether it really would be just changing the window dressing, because at the end of the day, there's a professional bureaucratic class that makes the most essential decisions in the United States. I know you're an optimist. Are you optimistic on that?
No. I just think it's so embedded. I think it could be a step in the right direction. Now, I disagree with a lot of what Trump says, a lot of his policies. But I do think he's definitely an outsider. And that's one of the reasons that Elon, who's been a lifelong left-leaning, and other Democrats have kind of started supporting Trump, even though they might disagree strongly with a lot of his policies or even dislike him. Because I think it could be a step in that direction. He's been very critical of mainstream media. He's been has been critical of kind of the stranglehold that we've seen on social media. He's been censored. He's seen as an outsider. But I don't know if he'll be able to, if he has what it takes to be able to change such a deep-rooted issue in like kind of the complex system that we call a democracy. I think there's so many layers to it that it's almost impossible to kind of break it all down. And I just don't see how any president will be able to kind of change that unless that we see significant action. Trump has had 4 years to do that. We haven't seen much of it. I hope the next 4 years, he's bringing RFK to the cabinet as well. He's offered Elon a position on his cabinet.
Is that exclusive news?
No. So I think it's been public. He's offered it on their interviews. Nothing exclusive. I do have some exclusive news on Pavel, some positive news on Pavel, but I cannot share it because I've promised secrecy. That's the only piece of exclusive news that I cannot share. But on the Elon thing, no, it's not exclusive. They've talked about it. So these are steps in that direction. I think if he has people like this around him, then we do have hope. But I've just seen so much. I've kind of experienced a lot of it as well. That makes it very difficult to be an optimist. But, let's see. Again, I'm a big believer in the U.S. democracy. I'm a big believer in the U.S. legal system. And I still think despite the cracks, there is a lot of hope and they can be fixed. I just don't think one president during 4 years could do that alone. I think it would take multiple presidents. It requires a shift among the US public. That's all that matters, because these presidents, whether it's Trump or future presidents, are looking for the votes. If the American voter starts treating this with the importance that it deserves, then presidents and other lawmakers are forced to act on it. I think it's all that matters. So what would really bring change is awareness, and we're seeing that people are starting to pay attention to it now.
So, we've talked throughout this conversation about the structural factors in free speech online and the geopolitical incentives. I want to share a take with you and get your reaction, because Russian philosopher Alexander Dugin wrote that Durov's arrest showed that no one will be able to remain neutral in an era of geopolitical turmoil. And he said that this is especially true for people who own major platforms, since information networks and flows play a key role in today's conflict. Do you think it's possible to have a free and open internet in an era of wars and sanctions?
Oh, that's something I can easily talk about from experience. So I've covered multiple issues, whether it's the war in Ukraine, whether it's the war in Gaza, US politics. I'm trying to find the most polarizing topics to kind of use as an example. I'll use those 3 examples. And I try to be as objective as possible. But what happens when you're objective is that the world has become so polarized. It's like you cannot have a stance unless you're labeled as pro-Ukrainian or pro-Russian. I've been called a Ukrainian spy. I've been called a Russian spy. I've been called a Hamas sympathizer. I've been called a Zionist. I've been called a far right and far left. It's because I can have a certain stance about a certain topic, but still not agree. So I can criticize Russia on the war in Ukraine without being pro-Russian, or I can criticize NATO or Ukraine on the war that we have in Ukraine without being pro-NATO, pro-Ukraine. I can criticize Israel, I can criticize Palestine, I can criticize Trump and Biden. But every time I take any sort of stance, I'm immediately labeled with something. And generally it comes, if it's a very strong stance and they dislike it, it comes with like a campaign of character assassination. I've gone through this so many times. Every time there's a polarizing issue, I go through a period of character assassination, people trying to bring me down for whatever reason. So it just makes it very difficult to be objective. And people have become very emotional about those topics. Like the war in Gaza has been one of the most difficult things for me to cover. It's a topic that many people don't want to even discuss, don't want to even touch. And it immediately becomes, if you look at US politics, every issue becomes left and right. Every single issue. Anyone that criticizes that, anyone that criticizes the war in Ukraine and that criticizes NATO is usually put in the bucket of being more right, leaning Republican, which is kind of surprising if you look historically at the Democratic position on wars. But anyone that's supporting Ukraine or that's actively pro-Ukraine is immediately labeled as more left-leaning. Doesn't make any sense. So your question is it possible to even have free speech or to have opinions without being influenced by geopolitical tensions? I just cannot imagine that. I'm trying to do that myself, and I'm not. There's not one side that likes me all the time. If I'm pro-Trump, then any Trump supporters would like me. But if I'm in the middle, that means I can criticize Trump. Pro-Trump supporters will criticize me. If I criticize Biden, Democrats will criticize me. That's a predicament of trying to be objective in a polarized world. It's a very difficult thing to achieve. And we've seen that in mainstream media as well. Like Fox, when Fox kind of started going, it started to become, it was many, many years ago. I was talking to a veteran in the media industry about a week ago. I was interviewing him. He started telling me the story of when Fox became, started attacking the Democratic Party. It's kind of forced other mainstream media platforms, mainstream media to kind of take a political stance. And over time, they've become more extreme and more blatant with that stance. So if I ask you right now, if I tell you CNN, the biggest media companies in the US, CNN, left or right?
Left wing, or I would say more left liberal, because I don't think CNN would be, in favor of nationalization or, some other, specific things that maybe Bernie Sanders would. But basically,
Oh, you could put him there. You could put him in the bucket. You could put him in the bucket of being leaning Democrat. Yeah.
yeah.
So obvious. Fox, right. MSNBC, left. So it's just become every single media platform it's almost like it's impossible not to take a stance, which is a scary world to live in. Because and even social media algorithms, again, RFK is very vocal on this. Even social media companies are exacerbating that problem. It's become, the algorithm because the algorithm wants you to stay on that platform. So what does it do? It feeds you the content that relates to you. So you keep listening to more content. So if you're pro-Trump, you want to listen to content that's criticizing Biden and supporting Trump. Because that's what the social media needs companies to do. So you spend more time on it so they can make more advertising revenue. What happens when they do this? It becomes a loop that takes you further and further into those echo chambers. And essentially the algorithm forces everyone to have different echo chambers. So it's kind of become embedded in society to take a stance. Media companies have taken a stance. Social media companies' algorithm, for financial purposes, force people to get into their own echo chambers. And if you add censorship to all this, then not only are algorithms now, social media companies, pushing you further down your whatever belief you have and kind of preventing you from listening to something that could challenge what you believe, which is very important for anyone really in any society. Censorship kind of adds another layer to this, where companies and governments further force their narrative down your throat in a very subtle way without you even knowing. And then when you have somebody, Elon, trying to break that status quo with X, they try to bring him down, as they've done to Meta over time, as they've done to YouTube and Google over time. And if someone doesn't abide by this, we've seen that with Pavel, we've seen that with Rumble being banned in European countries, and we've seen that with X banned in different countries and targeted in many democracies.
Is it time to maybe rethink the internet? Because back in the 1990s, there was an optimistic belief that globalization and digital technologies would erase national borders, erase language, cultural, racial divisions, and we would be living in a genuinely interconnected world. Fast forward to 2024, and I think that anyone from 1991 would be absolutely shocked. So are we seeing, I guess, sort of the final moments of techno-optimism, that the promise of the internet, just like the promise of globalization, hasn't come to fruition?
Techno-optimism is dead. I don't know what techno-optimism you see right now in the world. I don't think anyone's optimistic that the world is less polarized because of the internet. I thought that would happen as well. I thought with the internet, with the ability to communicate, cross-border communication and societies clashing and merging together, would make it a lot less likely that the world heads towards a world war. You look at us where we are today. Would make the world less polarized. Look where we are today. Yet, it's only getting worse. And for the reasons I've already explained, the days of the internet, the days of believing the internet could lead to more decentralization, kind of break down the stranglehold that small pockets of power had over their country or societies. The opposite happened. It's now become a lot easier to enforce censorship. It's become a lot easier to control narratives. And it became a lot easier to politicize speech. And we've talked about various examples, Pavel being the most recent example. What is the solution to this? I have no idea. Blockchain technology and crypto is now being talked about as one potential reason, because it leads to genuine decentralization, which we're talking about speech right now. But essentially, the whole concept of a CBDC, essentially a central bank digital currency. And the same issue that applies to speech applies to the transfer of wealth, the ability to freeze one's account anywhere in the world, the politicization of a currency like we've seen in the US dollar, the financial system now. You don't have cash that goes under your mattress; everything's sitting in banks. So as the world becomes digital, it's not only speech that's being centralized, every aspect of our life. And again, that's coming from an optimist. I promise you I'm an optimist. But from what I've said so far, what can you disagree with? Right now, I'm sure most of your money is sitting in a bank. The bank can freeze your account. We've seen that recently happen. It happens all the time. Various banks for various reasons. I'm not going to give examples because it immediately becomes political. But it happens. So that's when it comes to your money. Right now, if I say certain things, this video will be blocked on different social media platforms. So lucky we still have X and Rumble. So my speech is being controlled. My wealth could be frozen. We've seen people that, I've had Andrew Tate on my show a few times, and he's an example of someone that had not only his bank accounts frozen, he was banned off all social media companies. He's had his Uber account canceled. He's had his Airbnb account canceled. Does that seem like a more democratic, decentralized, free world that we live in?
Certainly not. And I guess, we're coming up on time. So I want to ask my final question, because throughout this interview, we've talked a lot about polarization. And one of the biggest polarization is between Russia and the West. You're a Western investor, a Western, popular host. There really aren't any conversations between Russians and Westerners in the format that we're doing right now. I guess, why did you agree to do this interview? And do you think that Russians and Westerners should have these sort of conversations more often?
All right, so that's a very important question. I think most problems, I run multiple companies, and one thing I've learned is whenever my employees argue, almost always the solution is just getting them together and just having dialogue, just having a chat, solves any problem. The same applies to some of the world's biggest problems, including wars. So on my show, we have millions of listeners, and on my X account, our impressions per month is about 2 billion. It's a massive audience from around the world. From Brazil right now, my content is I've got a really large Brazilian audience right now over the last 2 days because of what's happening with Brazil's crackdown on X, and potential ban on X. I've done a lot of coverage of the Ukraine war. And I'll give you some examples that you'd never see on any media platform. None. On my stage, I've had Russian and Ukrainian soldiers speak together on stage while they're in the war zone. I've had an Israeli pilot and a Palestinian journalist in Gaza who's had his family killed by airstrikes, most of his family members killed by airstrikes. It was one of the most emotional shows that I've done. They were on stage together talking. Where else would you have a Palestinian journalist and an Israeli soldier? I've had Lebanese politicians and Israeli journalists, not Israeli politicians, get together with the Lebanese politicians. It's illegal for a Lebanese citizen to talk with an Israeli. I've had them both on my stage multiple times. I've had Democrats and Republicans together on stage. It's still more common than the other examples I've given, but it's becoming rarer and rarer as well. It's just crazy to think of. And you'd be surprised when you get them together talking about the most sensitive topics. The example of the pilot and the Palestinian journalist is one perfect example. Is that the journalist again had his family killed by a pilot, and the pilot on stage said that he would still strike a hospital even if there were citizens there, if he got information that there's Hamas operatives in that hospital. And he started explaining why that's his personal stance. And he started having a discussion, an ideological discussion with that journalist. And they agreed on a lot more than you'd expect. A lot more than you'd expect. But what happens when you prevent that dialogue is that Russians and Ukrainians agree a lot more than you think. I'm going to use Russia and Ukraine as a topic to kind of hit a touchy topic for you. Russians and Ukrainians agree on a lot more than you'd expect. But because of all the parties involved, on both sides involved in the decision making, a simple problem of like, hey, which territory should be Russian, which territory should be Ukrainian. Well, Russians and Ukrainians, if they just sat down together, they could come to a solution and move on and the war would end. But there's so many external parties involved in that war, it becomes more of a proxy war, that these two sides just, not only, and I'm not speaking because their incentive is not to speak, the incentive is not to end the war. The same applies to the war in Gaza. The same applies to the polarization we're seeing in the US. I don't know how we could change that. I would love to see more media companies try to do what I'm doing. But the problem is it's not possible. If I have Russian soldiers and Ukrainian soldiers together, if I get Russian soldiers as an American media company, how do you think that will go? How do you think the government will react to this? I'll become a target. If it wasn't for X and I did the same thing on YouTube, my account would be suspended. So we've talked about how the internet kind of made the world even more controlled, and social media algorithms and censorship by various companies and governments has kind of led to more polarization, where you just no longer have that dialogue. And that leads to a very scary world that we're actually living in today. War between the world's largest or second largest nuclear power, with direct involvement or indirect involvement, direct, indirect, depending how you want to use that term, involvement from NATO, something I would have thought was impossible years ago. A former president, the assassination of almost assassination, the attempted assassination against Trump, the similarities to what we saw with RFK, which I thought was impossible again in the world we live in today. The banning of X in a country like Brazil, country I love Brazil, it's an incredible country. And a democracy like Brazil, the arrest of Pavel, is not a world one would have imagined many years ago. So would dialogues like this solve problems? Absolutely not. I've seen that happen time and time again. I'll continue doing what I'm doing. Would we see that? Do I expect to see that happen more often? No, I expect the opposite to happen. And I'm living the reasons why. There's countries right now on my list that I would not visit because of the same thing that you just talked about, trying to bring two sides together, trying to cover topics objectively, and trying to give everybody a voice on my platform. And that made me a target. Brazil launched an investigation into me because I brought people they want to censor on my stage. So that's the world we live in. I don't know what the solution is. All I hope is that people start paying attention to it more. I think that could be the only hope that we have, is that people start to take action on trying to break the stranglehold these powers have on us.
Well, Mario, we didn't come up to any solutions to the world's problems, but we had a candid and open conversation, which made me think more deeply, and I hope it made our audience members think more deeply. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Dimitri. I appreciate it.
Thank you all who tuned in. Till next time.